the Trump administration is now beginning to talk more and more the way the Europeans and the Ukrainians talk,
Right.
which is in a remarkably foolish way.
So recently, John Mearsheimer was on Deep Dive with Daniel Davis talking about the truth regarding Trump's Ukraine policy and why it's quite a bit different than the policy he had campaigned on for Ukraine, and why many of his supporters and dissidents that supported him believe this is an ultimate betrayal, the fact that he's arming Ukraine to an extent, even in some regards, that Biden didn't. So John Mearsheimer is one of the greatest geopolitical analysts as far as I'm concerned, so let's see what he has to say about it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
But first of all, just kind of like your overall take of what you may have expected based on what Trump had been saying before, and what did we get?
Well, I think what I expected and what you get is a lot of rhetoric from Trump, a lot of boasting, a lot of talking like a tough guy. But then in the end, he just doesn't deliver very much. And the problem that he faces is we don't have a lot of weapons in the inventory to give to the Ukrainians, as everybody has been saying ad nauseum for months now. And furthermore, we can't supply them with manpower, which is what they really need. And then he said, I'm going to punt on sanctions. They're not going to be sanctions now, maybe in 50 days. So if you sort of look at the threat to Russia that he's trying to deliver, it's just not much of a threat at all. It's just a lot of empty rhetoric.
Yeah, it is, and Russia was sanctioned up the gazoo even during the Biden administration. At one point, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, even pointed that out when they first opened diplomatic channels with Putin, because Biden had never done that. He talked a little bit about, hey, sanctions could be on the table, I guess, but they're already sanctioned up. And by the way, that hasn't exactly helped to withdraw them from the Donbass. What makes them think that that's a winning strategy? So if that's off the table, that's good. I think Trump does plan to impose tariffs on Russia. You know, again, it doesn't seem to be something that will dislodge them from that region if your endgame is to actually get them off of, you know, Zaporizhia and Kherson and Donetsk and Luhansk. I just don't think that's going to happen. So yeah, this is disappointing that Trump wants to resupply them and rearm them, but it's also the war propaganda. Like Mearsheimer is saying here, he's talking a big game about how, you know, Putin wants to conquer all of Ukraine and take Kyiv. It's the same stuff that Biden said and Blinken said and NATO was saying, you know, that Trump opposed. Trump said, I just want people to stop dying during the campaign. But I'm sorry to say that these policies are going to guarantee the continued dying of forces on both sides of that theater.
Well, in fact, let's just jump to see what that rhetoric was. Here's kind of the takeaway, the heart and soul of what we were all waiting to hear. Here's how he put it.
We are very unhappy, I am, with Russia, but we'll discuss that maybe a different day. But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. You'd call them secondary tariffs. You know what that means. And that's the way it is. It can be more simple, but it's just the way it is. I hope we don't have to do it.
You know, President Trump entered office saying that he would have this solved before he took office, after he had won. And then you had Keith Kellogg saying, well, 100 days, we'll have it done in 100 days. And then it was in April, we are days away from walking away from this. And then it turned out about a couple of months later, it was, well, about 2 weeks, I think we'll know. And now it's 50 days. What do you make of all these timeframes that Trump keeps giving?
Well, it's obvious they don't know what they're doing. I mean, they've made all these promises, they've never delivered, and here we are again. And the question you have to ask yourself is, where are we going to be in 50 days? Is the situation going to improve on the battlefield for the Ukrainians over the next 50 days? The answer is no, it's going to deteriorate. Are weapons all of a sudden going to magically appear in the cupboard for us to pull out and give to the Ukrainians? No, that's not going to happen either. And this whole talk about, you know, secondary sanctions, all sorts of experts have said that secondary sanctions just doesn't make any sense at all. They're not going to work. The fact is that Trump has no leverage, and he's going to be as bad off in 50 days as he is today.
Yeah, I have to agree. Also, it's important to note here what I would add on top of that is the fact that imposing sanctions like this on foreign regimes actually gives them a new propaganda tool to use against the United States and use against Ukraine in the war of information, in the war of propaganda, because they can just say, the economic plights that we're facing due to this war is solely because of the opponents that we're fighting in this war. They're levying these tariffs, which are hurting you. And they can pass that blame to the United States and to Ukraine and to NATO rather than, having that be some hindrance against the government. It just doesn't make sense. Time and time again, this proves out. It happened in Cuba. The sanctions against Cuba gives them a propaganda weapon against the United States. And in other countries, by the way, that this happens. So yeah, Mearsheimer's right. The only strategy here to end the war is to pull out, to disengage. The military-industrial complex won't allow that to happen, and Trump is surrounding himself with people with neocon foreign policy ideas like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio on this question. So we shouldn't be, surprised to know it's developing this way after all this time, even though this is duplicity. It is a 180 from what Trump campaigned on.
And let's look at those secondary sanctions for anybody in the audience who might not understand. Explain a little bit about what those are, and then why you say they actually aren't going to work.
Well, the thing is that the Russians have been sanctioned about as much as you can sanction any particular country.
Right.
There's not much you can do to the Russians in terms of sanctions. The secondary sanctions are designed to punish countries that trade with Russia, and that would include countries like China and India. And they're basically going to tell the United States to go take a hike when Trump threatens, to put these huge sanctions on both China and India and many other countries for trading with the Russians. They're going to feel they have the right to trade with China with Russia as they see fit, and they'll continue to trade.
Yeah, I think all this has done is solidified the BRICS alliance as, the new counterweight to the United States empire. It's the same that we saw from the Warsaw Pact during the first Cold War. And yeah, I think this is becoming a second Cold War. You had NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. When the Soviet Union dissolved, they dissolved the Warsaw Pact. But of course, the United States and the European countries committed to NATO, not only committed to its existence, its continuance, despite the fact that Russia was completely transformed in a radical way. They maintained that, but they also decided to expand that alliance, contrary to what James Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher and others told Gorbachev in the early 1990s or 89. I can't remember. I think it was 1990. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting on Face the Nation yesterday, CBS News. You had Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal were interviewed on there, and one of the really kind of provocative things that Lindsey Graham said. I know he's the big rhetoric, no power dude. But anyway, he specifically on that, he says we are going to have these huge secondary tariffs on China, India, and Brazil. Obviously, the core members of the BRICS team. So my first question to you is, you kind of answered part of it right there. What would those countries do? Would they have to make a decision? Because that's what Lindsey Graham said. This would force them to decide if you want to do business with America or if you want to do business with someone else. Doesn't this run the risk of making other people around the world, other countries, think, you know what, maybe we better go with the BRICS because that seems a little more stable?
Well, there's no question that all sorts of countries are interested in putting as much distance as possible between them and the United States. And given American policy on things like tariffs and sanctions, and even starting wars, this is fully understandable. But what's really going on here is that if Trump were to put these sanctions on, and they were to go into effect, if countries like India and China went along with them, it would have devastating consequences for the international economy. You just can't do this kind of thing. And they're not going. These countries like India and China are not going to accept these secondary sanctions anyway.
Yeah, I just can't see that this is going to change the course of this war in any significant way. If anything, this is just to going to continue the status quo, which is Russia holding about 85 or 90% of the Donbass, whatever it is now. And the potential for this to extend into a 20-plus year proxy war, like the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, went into a 20-year occupation. The potential for that seems greater and greater in my eyes. There doesn't seem to be any particular avenue that Trump is taking to lead us into a different course. It's mostly been Biden plus. Biden's status quo policy of arming the Ukrainians, plus, they did open negotiations with Russia, which is big. I commend them for. But it doesn't seem like that's, there's any serious mentality on the U.S. side of drawing down, disengaging here. We're still pumping money, intelligence, and ammo there, and Trump just announced more after campaigning against this. It's nutty. I can't see how any of his supporters can defend this now.
And so if they don't accept the secondary sanctions, and presumably there would be at least enough experts in the administration to realize that it's a gamble to make that threat, and then all of a sudden the other side takes the wrong course, so to speak, and moves against us, then that would harm our economy. Isn't that right?
Well, our economy is inextricably bound up with the international economy. So any damage you do to the international economy is going to blow back into the United States. And this is something that Trump doesn't want. You want to remember that one of the reasons that we moved so quickly to shut down the war against Iran after a mere 12 days was because we thought that the Iranians were going to mine the Straits of Hormuz. And that really spooked the Trump administration because they understood that that would have devastating economic consequences. The last thing Donald Trump wants at this point in time is trouble with the international economy, because again, trouble with the international economy spells trouble for the American economy. And this whole idea of secondary sanctions, of putting, massive sanctions on China and India and Brazil because they trade with Russia, is just, I think, not a serious argument.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, what point he made there that I think is so completely on point is the fact where he talked about how closely tied the U.S. economy is into the world economy. And that's because the dollar is the reserve currency of most of the world right now. And because of that, it's inextricably tied to the U.S. economy and how our stock market operates, how our GDP how GDP changes occur, etc. And if you're slapping on big tariffs on other countries, guess who it hurts? It hurts you too. It hurts your citizens. A tariff is a tax imposed domestically on foreign goods, and the same is true when other countries do that. So any attempt to harm other countries' governments a lot of the time just backfires because it does harm consumers within that other country a little bit. It's harder for them to acquire our goods, but it also hurts Americans in the country trying to consume goods that are either cheaper or they think more beneficial from foreign countries. That's the problem with tariffs in general. David Ricardo, knew this back in the 1820s, and, his empirical proof showing that comparative advantage is the way to go. Trading with your neighbors and having local specialization is the perfect solution. Otherwise, we would just embargo ourselves, have a full trade embargo, no trade going in and out, and even blockade our ports to stop it. It's so counterintuitive, but that's the ad reductio absurdum of this argument, that if you're a fan of protectionism and tariffs, you should just blockade your own country. That is the end point. So I'm with Mearsheimer.
Interesting about the reaction to this. So one of the first reactions I saw literally just right before we came on the air here, the initial response from Russian media on RIA Novosti was that Trump issues ultimatum on Ukraine. And they say, basically, they repeat the thing that he basically gave 50 days to come up with some kind of a deal. How much do you think Russia actually views? I mean, this is obviously not the state. This is just a media company here, but they use the term ultimatum because an ultimatum implies that you have the power to extract pain or do something really bad. But do you think the Russians actually view these threats as actual potential pain?
Well, I think a little bit of pain for sure, but not much pain at all. I think the Russians want to have good relations with the United States. I think the Russians want to shut down the war in Ukraine. The problem is that the Russians view what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. And as a consequence of that, they've come up with a series of demands, which Putin spelled out last June 14th, and which the Russians view as ironclad. They're just not willing to abandon those demands. And if Trump wants to settle this conflict diplomatically, he has to accept those demands. And he's unwilling to accept those demands, in large part because the people that he has surrounded himself with refuse to accept those demands. So the end result is that Trump has these useless conversations with Putin, and he sends Steve Witkoff off to Russia to have useless conversations with Putin, where we think we can get a ceasefire or we can get the Russians to cave in on their demands. And the Russians make it clear that that's not going to happen. And this leads us then to say that we're deeply disappointed, that it's Putin's fault, and so forth and so on. This is simply wrong. Putin has a set of demands. You either accept them or you don't accept them. And again, the Trump administration refuses to accept Putin's demands. And the end result is we are where we are.
Yeah, I totally agree with them. Not only do I think that Putin and Russia wants good relations with the United States, I think they are willing to shut this war down, contrary to all the propaganda out there. And if you want to argue otherwise, how do you explain Istanbul? You know, the overture that Putin gave Zelensky, the opportunity he gave him to sign a peace in the very early months of the war. I believe even just 2 months after the war began. We all know how that went. Boris Johnson and, Victoria Nuland, presumably from the United States, basically persuaded Zelensky not to take that off-ramp, to continue fighting, and we'd have his back, not his front, because all of his men are dying on the front, but we'd have his back, right? We know how that went, and Russia was interested in just ending the war then, even just then. But now, we're in this bogged down 3-year plus affair that could go on indefinitely, and I think Mearsheimer's right. The demands that Russia has to end this war have always been the same. It's no Ukraine in NATO. It's no Ukraine developing nuclear weapons. It's no NATO weapons being placed on the border that are dual purpose. The Aegis missile system can launch Tomahawks that can be headed with an H-bomb. You can do that. So that would be seen as a threat in the United States. If Russia did this in Mexico, that would be a serious concern, and you'd hear about it, and you'd hear war propaganda about it. We know what happened in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when essentially that same similar situation panned out off the coast of Florida here. So, this whole thing is nonsense. Trump isn't willing to meet these demands, even though they've always been clear. And even though he's campaigned on shutting this thing down, Russia really hasn't moved from its position the entire time. Ever since 2009, they haven't moved, since the "Niet means Niet" memo that Julian Assange released, thankfully for WikiLeaks' sake, where the American ambassador in Russia at the time, William Burns, he later became the CIA director under Biden, said, hey, I've talked to all the factions in Russia. The reddest of red lines, though, is trying to get Ukraine in NATO. And that's exactly what the Bush administration tried to do. The Obama administration flirted with it. The Biden administration flirted with it. And just days before Putin invaded in 2022, Kamala Harris was saying, hey, Ukraine needs to be in NATO. So this is a serious concern to them, and so are their other demands. So, yeah, I agree.
And, I found it interesting, puzzling, embarrassing, maybe is a better term, that one of the things that was asked of President Trump in the question and answer period after he'd made his comments here from one of the reporters in the room was that, do you think that this is going to actually force Putin into a peace deal? Watch this.
Could this transaction with NATO be viewed as a step towards achieving peace, letting Putin know that now Zelensky has a little bit more powerful tools in his tool chest, and maybe that brings him to the table to achieve peace? Because I know that you wanted to do that.
Brian, that's what we've been saying. I think you might have expressed it better if you wanted to.
That's exactly what. That's a summary.
That was a nice summary. I think he's done better than us.
This line here that, I think this is going to force Putin into come to the table for a peace on terms that we want. This was voiced all last week in Europe by Ursula von der Leyen and several other European leaders, Keir Starmer, et cetera, on this so-called rebuild conference that was held in Rome. And I just don't understand the logic behind it. And one of two things is at play, and I'd like your view on which it is. Either there is profound incapacity that they actually believe what they're saying, that they think that if we give a few more air defense missiles or a few more long-range missiles from Germany, from Tauruses or something, that could change the dynamic. And then all of a sudden, from a position of weakness, Putin would go, oh, darn, I guess I better go ahead and do what you guys want. Or is it that they don't actually believe that at all, but they're fine just continuing on with the war? Which do you think it is, or is it something different?
Well, what's going on here, just to unpack what you said a bit more, is that the Russians are winning on the battlefield. Almost everybody agrees with that point right now. Right? So they're winning. So the question is, how can Trump, given the decision he's just made, change that situation? What sorts of weaponry are we going to give to the Ukrainians? How are they going to use it? How are we going to shift the balance of power on the battlefield between the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side? And nobody ever says anything about that. They just talk about giving the Ukrainians weaponry as if this were some sort of magical solution. Well, maybe it is a magical solution, but if it is a magical solution, somebody has to tell us in considerable detail how this actually works.
Yeah, there's really no endgame. They don't, talk about actionable aims that will prove that this policy is effective. Like how much of the Donbass has to be retaken to show that this is an effective strategy, because $200 billion hasn't removed the Russians from the Donbass. What tells us that $300 billion of weapons will remove Russia from the Donbass? So Mearsheimer is exactly right. At the beginning of this war, sometimes you heard Biden flirt with, pie in the sky, ridiculous endgame potential things like, regime change in Russia, as if that was ever on the table. Even in a hot war, it doesn't seem like that would be easily on the table, like a hot nuclear war. And Biden flirted with that. Of course, Biden wasn't of sound mind, and the deep state was essentially running his presidency. But that's what we heard from some circles. We heard, a no-fly zone in Ukraine would be the thing to do, whereas that would likely guarantee a hot war and the invocation of, NATO as Article 5 in the NATO treaty, etc. So, yeah, I think Mearsheimer's is on point here. We haven't even heard, any kind of actionable aims that would show that our strategy is proving effective. It's just about supplying more arms, as if that's just the default state from which we just say, oh, yeah, I guess that'll work. That'll work, even though it hasn't in 3+ years, but I guess it's going to happen this time.
And of course, that never happens, because the fact is we don't have the weaponry to give to the Ukrainians to solve the problem. There is no military solution here. So all you have here is this empty rhetoric. And your question, of course, is, don't these people understand that? And at this point, I find it almost impossible to answer that question, because it would seem to me, after all these months, that the Trump administration would fully understand what's going on here and act accordingly. But the Trump administration is now beginning to talk more and more the way the Europeans and the Ukrainians talk, which is in a remarkably foolish way. Again, if you can't spell out to us, to people like you and me, how we rectify the situation by giving more weapons to the Ukrainians, or giving them more economic assistance, or giving them better strategic advice or better intelligence, if you can't tell a story there, this is all like tilting after windmills. It's just hard to believe. But as you and I both know, this is basically what American foreign policy has been all about for quite a while now.
Yeah, it has. And what really stuck with me that he said right there is how indistinguishable Trump and the Trump administration is starting to sound compared to Starmer and von der Leyen and Mears and Macron on these issues. He's starting to talk as if, we just have to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons, and that's going to yield some sort of a success. It's going to force Putin to capitulate somehow or come to the table, when it's very clear what Russia wants to come to the table. And it doesn't involve continued sending of weapons to Ukraine. It involves the U.S. withdrawing from that, guaranteeing that Ukraine can't enter NATO, that it won't have nuclear weapons, that it won't have NATO weapons on its borders, that it will protect the Russian-speaking and Russian cultural peoples of Ukraine, that it will involve denazification of Ukraine. And yeah, there are Nazi contingents in Ukraine. We all know about Azov now. Mainstream media reported on that up until 2022, and now that was swept under the rug after that point, right? But the clear list of demands is articulated, even if you don't believe Putin's rhetoric on that. It was articulated in the draft treaty that he sent to NATO on the eve of his invasion, which, by the way, was in the 8th year of what was already a civil war within the Donbass region between pro-Russian peoples and the Ukrainian regime. I won't rehash that. I've talked about that in a lot of other videos. But in the draft treaty he sent to NATO, he said, if you just put it in writing that you will not include Ukraine in NATO and a few other minor stipulations, I won't invade Ukraine. And instead of considering that and actually weighing that as an option, which is a reasonable option, by the way, the U.S. wouldn't accept Mexico in a Russian alliance. I don't think so whatsoever, or Canada. Instead of doing that, Jens Stoltenberg, who was the head of NATO at the time, the general secretary, laughed about it and said, yeah, we didn't do this at all. Instead, Putin got exactly what he didn't want. We're flirting with adding Ukraine and NATO, and he got war. He got war instead of peace, despite the fact he wanted peace. That's what Stoltenberg did, and this is on video. You can see this today. So yeah, the only solution in Ukraine is to draw back, disengage. That will force a peace, and it will force the Europeans to deal with it instead of the United States. The United States, it's not our fight. It's not even our government's fight, except for the government's will to make it a fight. And that was laid out ever since the 1990s, when Bill Clinton decided to engage in the first wave of NATO expansion, which has taken the form of like 5 waves now and has pushed all the way, contrary to what James Baker and Jürgen Krobog and Hans-Dietrich Genscher said to Gorbachev, all the way to Ukraine, all the way to Russia's borders. And it doesn't seem to be going back on that. Putin's behaving exactly how we always could have thought he would for at least the last decade, for at least since 2014, when the U.S. assisted in the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine to put in a bellicose government toward Russia, as the U.S. always wanted. And that was the Maidan coup, where U.S. aid funneled money into those protests in February 2014 in the coldest winter months to keep those protests going. It was not exactly organic. Yeah, Yanukovych had its critics, but the U.S. was involved in that coup in the same way that the U.S. was involved in coups in Chile and Iran, which that was rehashed recently, in Guatemala and other cases. So that's where we're at right now, but I do want to hear what you guys have to say. Let me know down below, is Mearsheimer right about this? Is there any solution militarily for solving the war in Ukraine, or does the U.S. just have to disengage? And what is Trump's endgame here? Does he expect that his base will swallow this policy during the entire duration of a second term without a peace? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the video, subscribe to Daniel Davis too. He has great guests, really good foreign policy channel there too. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you become a YouTube member, click the join button below. You'll help support the channel financially, and you'll get access to all my videos before they come out live to the general public. And with that said, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.